Nature is humanity's best friend. Without nature, we have nothing. Without nature, we are nothing. Nature is our life support system. It is the source and sustainer of the air we breathe, the food we eat, the energy we use, the jobs and economic activity we count on, the species that enrich human life, and the landscapes and waterscapes we call home.
A year ago, we decided to get involved with Global Compact Network Canada to create a working group about biodiversity. This working group was composed of representatives from a dozen of Canadian companies and met regularly to discuss the TNFD framework. The goal was to explore how this framework can serve as an accelerator for elevating the biodiversity discussion at the strategic level within our respective organizations. As many of you know, the world is facing a double crisis, a climate crisis and a biodiversity crisis. The pace at which we are losing plants, animals, insects is alarming. And to add to it, species are migrating, moving, and taking new territories, disturbing many ecosystems. Invasive species are also proliferating, posing an additional threat to our ecosystems. The number of species in a critical state is growing. Since 2011, the world has witnessed the extinction of several species, including the western black rhino, the mountain mist frog, the pintec giant tortoise, amongst others. Ici au Québec, au Canada, certaines des espèces ont déjà disparu et plusieurs autres sont dans un état de vulnérabilité extrême. La baleine grise est un exemple qui a disparu. Et nous connaissons les statuts précaires des caribous, des belugas, des saumons et d'autres sortes de poissons, des amphibiens comme l'arénote faux-grillon et le chevalier cuivré. La disparition des milieux humides et autres environnements naturels de haute valeur est aussi préoccupant et fait partie de cette discussion. La migration des tigres vers le nord ainsi que la propagation de la maladie de Lyme est aussi un bel exemple de menaces émanant des écosystèmes. La population d'oiseaux sont en diminution constante. Les abeilles ont de la difficulté à trouver des fleurs pour butiner, impactant les populations d'abeilles qui sont en forte baisse. There's a global scientific consensus that we have already lost 10% of all genetic biodiversity existing on planet Earth. La nature a aussi des bienfaits au niveau de la santé mentale et physique des humains. Les environnements naturels permettent de réguler le climat en régulant les îlots de chaleur et procurent aux humains des opportunités d'améliorer leur santé. It has been demonstrated that over half of the world GDP is linked to nature. Nature also plays a significant role by rendering many services such as filtering water, protecting us from storms, and regulating species population and acting as reservoir for diseases and viruses. In other words, a strong nature keeps us safe, healthy, happy, and supports stronger economies. Yet we have never paid a penny to account for these services from Mother Nature. Perhaps one day we will start to internalize these externalities. All that said, many organizations struggle to figure out how to tackle biodiversity at the enterprise level. And I can understand that. You know, at WSP, we're lucky, on est chanceux chez WSP, on a des experts en biodiversité, mais la plupart des organisations ne peuvent pas compter à l'interne dans les organisations sur cette expertise-là. Donc, je peux comprendre que les gens ne savent pas par où commencer quand c'est le temps de penser à biodiversité à l'intérieur d'une stratégie ESG, par exemple. But TNFD can be the answer to that question, actually. Similar to climate and to the TCFD framework, TCFD is a similar framework that is probably a bit better known at this point, but TNFD is gaining traction. But similar to TCFD, it provides a good framework to identify risks and opportunities related to biodiversity. It offers a structured approach for companies to disclose dependencies on nature. That's why we, WSP, partner with UN Nation Global Compact Canada to produce this guide entitled TNFD Essentials, a beginner's guide to nature-related financial disclosures. Adopting TNFD framework can only help companies and industries align their nature-related goals, risks, and opportunities. It should open up a new way of looking at the company's dependencies, providing for better performances and enhance reputation. It will enable better sustainable development investment choices and foster stronger stakeholder trust. This will position your organization ahead of the curve and ready for the next cycle of stakeholder expectations. The challenges we face with biodiversity are immense, but also are the opportunities. By adopting frameworks like TNFD, we can transform these challenges into actionable strategies that not only protect our natural world, but also drive sustainable business growth. You know, there's one thing that I often say about biodiversity is, and that's something that I saw on the screens this morning when I came in, is nature is strong. Quand on donne l'opportunité à la nature de reprendre sa place, la nature revient rapidement. Puis si on compare avec le challenge des changements climatiques, les changements climatiques sont ici pour rester. Ça va probablement durer 300 ou 400 ans. On va devoir probablement vivre avec un monde à probablement 2 degrés plus chaud que l'ère pré-industrielle. Mais la biodiversité, ça peut revenir en l'espace d'1 ou 2 générations. Give nature good conditions and we'll come back because it's strong.
Biodiversity is essential within the Sustainable Development Goals. SDG 14, which actually in its fulsome form is conserve and sustainably use the oceans, seas, and marine resources for sustainable development, otherwise known as life below water. And SDG 15, protect, restore, and promote sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems, sustainably manage forests, combat desertification, and halt and reverse land degradation and biodiversity loss, otherwise known as life on land for short. Biodiversity loss adversely affects every other SDG, from good health and well-being to decent work and economic growth. At the UN Global Compact, we are the world's largest corporate sustainability initiative. 22,000 companies around the globe make a commitment at the CEO level to uphold the 10 principles of the UN Global Compact, to advance the principles, to try to advance the Sustainable Development Goals, and to report on these annually. We accelerate and scale the global collective impact of business by upholding these principles and delivering the SDGs through accountable companies and ecosystems that create change. For us, a positive and sustainable future relies on the bold and ambitious actions of business to move forward faster, including on biodiversity. And now we pass the challenge to you, to all of you. We encourage you to take up this guide and the commitment to work on the ways that your companies can fortify biodiversity and work against loss for the sake of our communities, our country, and our planet.
The Convention on Biological Diversity is actually headquartered in Montreal since 1994, just across the road from where we're sitting today. The CBD has currently 196 signatories, and every 2 years, parties of the CBD meet for their Conference of the Parties, where they decide on a number of issues, policy, materials, global agreements, etc. In 2022, the CBD parties came together at this very palais to adopt what became known as the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. This framework is supposed to be a blueprint for the entire world on how to manage natural resources and how to ensure that the loss of biodiversity is not only stopped, but also reversed. The Global Biodiversity Framework was adopted with a whole of government and a whole of society approach. This in practice means that governments will have to look into their structure, policy making, financing, procurement in a holistic way to integrate biodiversity considerations and biodiversity values across the board. Countries will also have to figure out ways to develop policy instruments to address the biodiversity financing gap, which is estimated at a whopping $700 billion a year. And with that, countries will also have to look into harmful subsidies to the environment and repurpose them to incentivize positive behavior. The Global Biodiversity Framework, or the GBF as we kindly refer to it, is comprised by 4 global goals looking into 2050 and 23 action-oriented targets looking into 2030. It is important to underscore that several of these 23 targets are directly or indirectly related to economic sectors. Forestry, fisheries, agriculture, finance are explicitly mentioned along with cross-cutting themes that are also related to business activities such as trade, pollution, to name a few. Target 15 of the GBF is branded as the private sector target, as it calls on businesses and financial institutions to assess, monitor, and disclose on their impacts, risks, and dependencies on biodiversity loss. That is actually the backdrop against which the Task Force on Nature-Related Disclosures was developed and launched, and all of the work that has been done so far. Having structured frameworks such as the TNFD will be immense help to companies to better understand how to move the needle. And I echo what was said today. I mean, I understand that for the private sector at the moment, it's a bit confusing, and organizations are now struggling to understand exactly how that impacts them, what they can do to address this, and how to move forward. So having a guide that actually distills what are the key steps that needs to be taken, where action needs to start, I think is super relevant. That's why I was so happy to see the work that you guys have developed the Global Compact alongside WSP, because this is super timely and super useful for companies. In our daily engagement with the private sector entities, we keep hearing we need more guidance. We need to understand how this can materialize. What at the company level can we do? And I think the guide is a very good first step for this.
Long before this guide took shape, we knew that the private sector in Canada and elsewhere were looking at the topic of biodiversity. When it comes to resources supporting businesses in particular on this topic, this is a bit of a gap on a global scale, and us as the UN Global Compact Network Canada and WSP wanted to do something about this. When our teams met, us at UN Global Compact Network Canada and WSP, one question was quite clear. What did businesses need in order to even consider reporting under this framework? Our hypothesis was that the resources out there, particularly from the TNFD itself, were good and also often required a level of nature-related knowledge or experience or corporate buy-in as a prerequisite, which we suspected that an average sustainability or finance professional at an average company would not have. Out of this, we convened the Biodiversity Working Group you've heard mentioned throughout the course of our keynotes today, with the goal to gather companies together, in this case Canadian companies, and hear from them what their challenges were in considering to start reporting under the TNFD, and then to collaboratively workshop solutions to those challenges that we could then share more broadly. The TNFD Essentials Guide is the outcome of those conversations. It's a beginner's guide that can serve as an early stage prioritization and capacity building tool for companies that are starting to look at the TNFD from scratch. It lays out a framework for the action items needed to confidently commit to TNFD reporting as a company, which is the starting point of the TNFD's own guidance, that commitment.
So I think what we really saw in the private sector as we were coming into the working group was, there was a lot of companies that maybe had started a little bit in their nature journey or were considering nature, but there was also a lot of trepidation, I think, around the TNFD. It's new, it's quite challenging. Biodiversity itself is a challenging topic, and to add to that all of the rest of nature, which is what the TNFD covers, including things like water, even air, soil, and putting all that together also in this view of both what are your impacts on nature, but also, what are all of your dependencies? What do you need from nature as a business, and how does that affect your operations? It's a very large topic, and so I think we saw in the private sector some strong interest, but quite a bit of trepidation, and I think that was a big reason for kind of convening the group and coming together to talk about the TNFD and how folks could potentially move past that trepidation and sort of, as August pointed out here, get into the specifics of how you do something, how you get started.
I saw maybe 2 years ago that biodiversity and nature was really gaining momentum. And although from a conceptual perspective, I understand it. I'm able to see why it's important. I really didn't feel I was equipped to talk about it in a relevant manner in my own company. So that's, I think, when I started to be really anxious. You talked about that anxiety. So I'm like, oh my God, at some point, I'll be asked to work on this. And I want to make sure I'll be giving great answers. And I don't have the luxury of having biologists that work with me closely in my company. So I felt like this group was really the best opportunity for me to take some time, look at the different guidance, see what tools are available, network with companies that are at the same place that I am, and also so that I'm able to start to articulate a business case, because you showed it, like at the end, I need to be able to make the business case to my leadership team that this is something that is important and we need to be focusing on, and it's not just about climate change. So that's why I thought that's the best opportunity I can have to start building my own capacity and then help support the teams internally.
One thing that stood out to me was there was one session where we had a very candid conversation about greenwashing, which I think is a question that was on a lot of people's minds, possibly even more so now. So this was pre-Bill C-59, but still there were concerns about greenwashing. And so we had a great discussion about what you can and can't do with the TNFD. And so there's certainly opportunity in your disclosure for highlighting the opportunities that your company is taking to minimize impacts and reduce dependencies on nature and just manage those nature-related risks. But we also discussed that it's really not a promotional platform. And so that the underlying tenet, I guess, of the TNFD is transparency. And that doesn't mean that you have to disclose on absolutely everything. You don't, but what you do choose to disclose on, at least for starters, it needs to be transparent.
What I also learned is that perfection is not required to make progress. So we do not need to have wait to have like specialized expertise in biology or dozens of KPIs to start the TNFD assessment. We can just start by questioning ourselves about what are our impacts, our dependencies towards biodiversity. What are the risks? What are the opportunities? What KPI did we measure already? What else can we measure? And based on that, like what can we do to improve ourselves? And the TNFD website and the guides and all the tools and references provides everything that we need to start taking the challenge, and it does it in a very comprehensive and structured manner. And I want to say that I feel very privileged to have participated in this working group, and I really hope that this collective effort has helped highlight the needs and concerns of companies that want to start to address the issues related to biodiversity and the TNFD assessment.
So the gap that I think we're really filling with this very focused getting started guide with the TNFD to try to just take those first steps and take some action is to condense a lot of that material down into something that's easily digestible, pretty simple to use, and is only a handful of pages long. You can read it in less than 30 minutes. And we also have links, of course, to some of the more dense material. But I think that's really the gap that we were filling with our product, with our tools.
The nature and biodiversity crisis, it's a global problem, and it's not going to be solved in isolation. And so I would encourage everyone in this room to seize those opportunities and even seek out those opportunities for collaboration. And that could be just within your organization. That's a really important part of addressing the TNFD requirements. The transparency aspect of the TNFD requires that. I think it really leads to collaboration. And it will be through that collaboration that we tackle this global problem and halt and reverse biodiversity loss.
These aren't things to remember. They're not things to keep in mind. These are things that you can do. They're pages you can read, questions you can research, small decisions you can make, and people you can talk to in your company or elsewhere. Our message throughout the guide is hopefully clear, that the most important thing you can do for nature-related reporting is just to get started. It doesn't need to be perfect. It doesn't need to be complete. All you need is a commitment to embark on this corporate journey and enough knowledge about your company to situate yourself in that flowchart. You can follow the guide from there.